Thank you, Charles, and it's lovely to be back here again in such a great venue on probably my favourite event of the year. So, I'm going to take you through a bit about these cultural drivers, as Charles was just saying. So, why are these trends happening? Are they just appearing from anywhere? Well, actually no, and we have dug deep this year to see what those emotional and cultural pushes are that create these trends. So first of all, let's just think about why they're important. The true meaning of a brand and a service does come alive more through the visual, verbal, and atmospheric, experiential ways in which it's delivered. In fact, each sign, code, and symbol tells a very different cultural story through the context that it puts itself in. Let's take the humble hamburger, be it one from, say, Impossible Burger, McDonald's, or even a 3-starred Michelin restaurant. Each has a very different value and meaning. And it's these subconscious messages delivered through pack design, decor, communications, atmosphere, format, which really bring the experience to life in a differentiated way. I'm guessing you can already see each one's brand and meaning on the screen here. And in fact, notice how they get smaller as they get more expensive. So how do we actually go about identifying these macro cultural trends? Well, I'm going to share with you a little bit about how we decode and use these, and also some of the background drivers in our culture, and these that affect the emergent contextual codes. So essentially, the food people identify, gather the trends, and then they analyse them for their strength across the world, as Charles has just been showing you. We then take the imagery and the context of these, the signs, the codes, the symbols, and unearth the meaning of those in culture behind them. From this, we can then unlock those macro drivers I'm going to talk to you about, and more importantly, how to create those unique brand and product opportunity platforms underneath them. So you can see here from the big wheel that Charles was talking about, how culture overlays upon all of these foods, codes, signs, and symbols, and how the trends are created through these big stories going on. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the big themes this year, and I'm going to take you on some of the highlights of the shifting stories underneath them. When we work with clients, we translate these into their own unique innovation platforms. So you don't just have the obvious trends that you see, but you have how to code them and sign them in a way that's unique and relevant for your brand. Our big global theme this year is securing the future, as Charles was talking about. And underneath that are a number of these macro cultural trends that help explain those food and drink trends. Beneath those are actually a number of driving forces behind the trends that make them happen. So how do we identify why these cultural behaviours are happening? Well, each of these has a number of emotional needs and behaviours. Some of them feel very familiar because they're ever present, and others have emerged and are new. But actually, even those are not completely new, and when we delve back in time, we can actually see these cyclical drivers coming through. So, here's some cultural highlights, and let's have a little look at some of my favourites that we've got in this year. We'll start off a little bit with understanding that big one in the middle and why it's happening. So, securing the future. Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher, is quoted as saying, "Change is the only constant in life." And so it is proven true. And thank goodness, Charles, otherwise we'd be out of jobs. But at the moment, it will come as no surprise that we're actually at a bit of a tipping point where we all get to decide the part we want to play, or not, in our future. As we've seen, last year's central theme was revolution, and this is morphing into a very interesting consequential actions or non-actions, be that political, social, environmental, or economic. The changes that are going on around us, and it's not just about food. Now, many of our trends this year are the response to the beliefs that change and a new order is needed, or conversely by some, those that want to hold desperately on to what we know. Now, this belief actually rises and falls throughout history, sort of punctuated by phases of stability, peace, and calm. This is so-called millenarianism, which was documented by Norman Cohn, and it's an outbreak in the belief that current social and political systems actually need to be broken and then reinvented, because it's believed these are now obsolete and ineffective. And we can obviously see this going on locally at the moment. This may feel unsettling, but actually it's a time of opportunity, and we now have heroes emerging to help us save us from ourselves. And you might think this is happening for the first time, but actually when you look back in history, it's happened time and again. A similar parallel to this millenarianism occurred in the Age of Enlightenment, or the age known as the Age of Reason. It was an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated the world and the ideas of Europe, dating to the 18th century. Philosophers, scientists widely circulated ideas through meetings in academies, Masonic lodges, literary saloons, and even coffee houses, interestingly. An opportunity there, I hear. The ideas of the Enlightenment undermined the authority of the monarchy and the church and paved the way for our political revolutions of the 18th and 19th century. And it was about ideas of reason and the primary source of knowledge. And these ideas were about liberty, progress, toleration, and an emphasis on the scientific method. Now that's really interesting because we're going to touch upon that again in a moment. And we do see this in culture, more popular culture. In fact, if anybody is watching Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials on the television at the moment, this is a very similar allegory in a plot line in culture. So, let's have a look at some of those macro drivers underneath our securing the future trend. So we've heard about redress and reconnect. And why is this happening? Well, this constant theme of climate breakdown, economic misery, and political turmoil has now prompted us to start reflecting on where did it all go wrong? Have we gone too far? And many are now craving to reconnect more actively with our planet and the good old days before the Industrial Revolution, artificial chemicals, modern technology. And we've obviously seen the naturalness trend of the last 2 decades. We talk about that a lot when we talk about our residual, dominant and emergent codes and categories when we do some semiotic mapping. And that naturalness has been there for a while. But actually what we're seeing now is a more active engagement to secure the future. So quite a shift. And this is because there's this increasing sense of urgency that we've all heard about. And we're now wanting to take action ourselves. And we're starting to see this not just with individuals, but also communities, as well as food producers and suppliers. And we have our ethical heroes to inspire us. And then hacks and pragmatic food ideas that we've just seen, going back to our ancient methods, are becoming ever more relevant to the mainstream. And I can't wait to hear the talk later about biodiversity that relates to this. So that takes us on to the thoughtful capitalism big trend that Charles was talking about. So why have we begun taking things into our own hands and making the world of food more morally sound? Let's just have a look and see. So Charles has talked to us about this thoughtful capitalism, and here's a number of drivers culturally that are making it so. One thing that's really interesting is that we have this mindful empowerment driver. Now, for some time, we have been quietly training ourselves to become more thoughtful and to take time to think about our actions and their consequences. We see this with mindfulness, apps such as Calm and Headspace, which are huge. Schools are even teaching our children meditation. And this has all pioneered our collective understanding of being more conscious in the way that we live. Combine that with the leadership now coming from many ethical voices that have been treated as heroes and thought leaders, so our David Attenboroughs, our Gretas, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders abroad. This is now translating into real grassroots actions. And we've been talking about this for a long time, but ethics are actually getting more real. Here we just have one example of how this might manifest in food, the Culpeper in London, cooking with produce from their rooftop garden. But there's many more great examples in the Food Trends deck this year. Charles then touched upon our next big macro trend of pragmatism rules. So why are these unthinkable solutions that have not really been mainstream now coming into force across the piece? Well, it's really about the necessary ways to adapt. Here we have the thoughtfulness driving our realization for the need to actually change. And so we see the behaviors, such as life hacks and computer hacks that we've had for a while, now being translated to find more efficient cheats that deliver clever, immediate changes to our impact upon the environment. And this, in fact, has actually been occurring for centuries, where the proper way of traditional idealism has often been overcome by this need to adapt for one reason or the other. And in fact, we have been adapting ourselves and inventing fixes for some time. But now it's to solve this environmental problem. And this very different approach has arisen, not just around the world, but with ourselves. And this means now finding ways not only to consume less and waste less, but actually it's now aspirational to desire less and be happy with a more minimal approach to life. And in the words of Mahatma Gandhi, be the change that you wish to see in the world. So what does this mean in the world of food and drink? Well, we've seen before converting waste into products, and I loved the talk with Doug McMasters a few years ago from Silo, who has really paved the path here. But being more sensitive to seasonal, greener packaging, smarter ways to grow foods in cities, and reconsidering these less valued formats that Charles was just talking about. The picture up here of an example being the sustainable tinned mussels from Seattle's Little Fish that he mentioned earlier. And this is really celebrating gourmet seafood, but in its most humblest form, the tin, which is fascinating. But with every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, as we all know. And so with every trend, it is true that there's often an opposite. And scientists have proven, and as Richard Dawkins told us in his landmark book, The Selfish Gene in '75, we are innately selfish and thus seek constant gratification. And food, of course, is essential to this. It's always provided enjoyment over history. Interestingly, unlike previous decades, where we actually feared processed foods, particularly us Gen Xers and the baby boomers, where we actually saw food harm us and were worried about processed foods, we're now actually prepared to use modern developments in technology. And we're allowing engineered food to push the boundaries as much as possible. What's interesting is think of this. Remember our scientists and the Enlightenment. Well, think about this as food enlightenment. This is in part because emerging generations just didn't have those memories of discovering processed foods were harming us. And we're also becoming less tolerant of tedious things and mundane things because we want life, in particular, our consumption of food, to be easy, quick, now ethical, hopefully, and still deliver the experience that we have become used to. So, we therefore move to one of our example areas Charles was just showing us. Why is it that highly engineered food is actually being increasingly accepted and, more than that, actually glamorized? Well, this is particularly fascinating, and for those of us that like a bit of sci-fi, very intriguing, because science fiction becomes fact. So those of us that embrace progress, in an increasingly polarized world, The opinion and beliefs of those who reject science often at odds with those who embrace it. But the rejectors sadly live in fear that new technologies are going to damage them and their children, whilst those who embrace it and science tend to be much more optimistic and embrace disruption. This is exemplified by our denizens of Silicon Valley, the Elon Musks of this world. But we actually, as humans, delight in the impossible. This is where sci-fi comes in. Food that has been engineered has an element of extra excitement because it matches a symbolism of mythical, magical, supernatural entities. Meat, but with no biological parents, for example, evokes the idea of the gods and the heroes of myth who have only one or maybe no parents. And foods made by artificial synthesis evoke visions of a Star Trek universe. The fact that new food forms feel impossible to our common sense mind actually gives them a counterintuitive power, an intrigue, akin to fantasy. It's also interesting if you pair that with FLAVOUR appeal, which is that the engineered foods are more appealing because they're expensive and exclusive. FLAVOUR was a Norwegian-American economist and sociologist who created this effect that explains that goods can be more desirable because they're more expensive. And his work has actually been embraced very recently by economists to explain the psychology of conspicuous consumption and the adoration of these luxury goods. So if engineered foods are actually pricey and inaccessible to most people, this will make them more appealing to those who can afford them. So in the end, this delivers for us a real opportunity of fantasy food. So this cutting-edge food invention, that foods are literally engineered in a lab, such as the perfect day ice cream that Charles has just shown us, made from cow's DNA. The appeal is actually multifold, and we've talked about this a lot with the Impossible Burger, haven't we, Charles? Where, in fact, it's better for the planet, and exciting and desirable, and exclusive, and slightly sci-fi. Other examples, therefore, would be motherless meat, vegan fish, molecular coffee. They all serve to build this sort of ultimate sci-fi and mythic fantasy. So let's look at one of the other big macro trends that Charles talked to us about, cultural creativity. So when we are amidst a big crisis, be it climate, economic, and/or political, or even all three, we crave often to either cocoon ourselves and protect ourselves, or the exact opposite, and reach out to the world and embrace our interconnectedness, accept our differences, and celebrate that otherness. What is interesting is through openness to these others, you get this wellspring of creativity. And our minds actually seek the new, and we gain satisfaction from the stimulation of discovery, firing in the amygdala part of our brain. And in the world of food, this has had a number of manifestations. Let's have a quick look at one of these. So if we look at that culture exchange area that Charles mentioned, why are traditional foods being fundamentally reimagined? So if we look at cultural transformation, it's all about radical rethinks. And this is about fighting cultural conservatism. So the nationalistic drive seeks to insulate us from them and preserve cultural traditions like respecting the flag, honouring old school ways of doing things. However, the counter trend is that racial, gender, and other human rights must be fought for, and that means fighting against the way things have always been done. Creativity in food correspondingly parallels this rejection of what is orthodox. And we've seen in the past this world upside down. Traditionally, throughout many global cultures, there are mechanisms that challenge, invert, subvert all of these norms periodically, particularly in things like carnivals, written about by Russian social theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. He talks about special public celebrations where normal identities are actually turned upside down and everything from eccentric behaviour to even profanities becomes not just acceptable but expected. And creativity is therefore based on challenging those norms, transforming the orthodox into the unorthodox. And this transforming is actually also mirrored and chimes with Margaret Boden's type of creativity, which is transforming the space, where behaviour changes radically. Einstein actually did this, where he turned the conventions of Newton's wisdom upside down in how the world works and turned it inside out. But we see this in food, with food evolution and food revolution. And food is always being reimagined. We all know that. We've seen it across the whole of our careers, probably. But here we're reaching a new phase of this type of creativity, which is really challenging the orthodoxies and properness, almost on purpose. If you then add to this the creativity and the genius of some of these lovely chefs that we're going to enjoy some lunch from later, whose vision you eat and drink, this is really new food culture rethought and recreated for today. And I must admit, I'd really like to try this pizza with avocado and egg on it. Bit of brunch. So, let's look at our last big macro-cultural driver, the pleasure principle. So in our very turbulent world, we seek to escape from the drama and the everyday mundane through pleasure. And food, of course, has always been this great source of pleasure, as we've said. But flavours are continuing to move in really exciting directions. But its secrets are now being laid bare more through science and experimentation, turning foodstuffs that might otherwise have been low quality or even disgusting on its head. And this is through things like valuing aging and fats, as we've just heard, and something traditionally unthinkable, as we were talking about, with moulding. Add to this more sophisticated use of floral flavours and more refined ways to achieve sweetness, and food is now reaching new heights of exquisiteness. But what's fascinating is what's going on in our brains behind this. Why are these new exquisite and exciting flavours being used in such extraordinary ways to get this deeper flavour? And what we're trying to do is excavate to the more exquisite flavours yet to be discovered. Now, of course, the impact and the importance of taste has been known for centuries. The spice trade has accessed new and extraordinary tastes for generations. The science of pleasure has only really recently begun to truly understand what makes things tasty. But the historic precedent of how we discover things to be delicious and exquisite is really well known. And this brings us to inverted disgust. So, explaining why we're eating mould. One way to discover is actually through outrage and disgust. And this doesn't just work on food, it also works in other aspects of life, such as sex. But let's go back to food. The first time we drank coffee, tea, alcohol, or even ate olives, anchovies, Chinese bird's nest soup made from saliva, or even Swedish fermented herring, let's be honest, we're all a little bit disgusted. So crazy delicious food actually is helping us to understand these new exciting tastes. And the most intriguing way is through processes and foods that otherwise might be linked to either very low quality or even disgust. And so that's why we're seeing this moulding process come through, because it gives us these very difficult, complex, but once understood and learnt on our taste buds, adorable tastes. And most of us have gone through that process where we couldn't bear to drink coffee or olives. And now I can devour a whole bowl, especially if they're stuffed with anchovies, both of which disgusted me when I was about 5, I'm sure. Here we see from Noma in Copenhagen this mould pancake with truffle. There's also lovely examples in the book, such as hot dogs reinvented with carrots and smoked and aged for 5 days, a 10-year-old dairy cow tomahawk, and even things like aubergine with fungus. Anyone? How do we actually go about applying these trends? Now I've taken you through a little bit of a highlights tour of some of the interesting drivers. Why bother to collect them and look at these as well? And it's really because it's the way for you to make your unique set of innovation platforms that are actually relevant to your brand and have deeper meaning. Because the issue with the trends is there are lots of them. In fact, about 60, I think, and we can't actually implement all of those. So which should you use, and how do you implement them to your brand in your own unique way? Well, it's the semiotic codes that can be carefully selected to represent your unique meaning of your brand in culture and society. Overlay these with the food codes, and together you get these special, unique propositions. That may sound all very clever, but in fact, you already have many of the ingredients to do that within your business. The magic is just creating the right jigsaw puzzle and then implementing them consistently using these relevant signs, codes, and symbols. So how do you actually do that? I hear you ask. So what we do is we actually select the macro-cultural trends that relate to your world. We then cross-reference those with the signs, codes, and symbols that relate to those and create these visual and verbal platforms from these. We then bring them all together with cross-functional teams to drive innovation co-creation sessions. And then you can innovate under each of the platforms that you have. The next step is the one you probably usually go through: develop, test, and refine your innovation pipeline from this. But the magic is actually that you've created these unique platforms from which you can innovate all of your touch points. Like we were saying at the beginning, when you have a burger, how you present it, package it, the ambience, the atmosphere, the whole story around it is really relevant to make it anything from your McDonald's experience all the way through to your Impossible or 5-star Michelin restaurant. So that's all of the trends and the stories I'm going to tell you today. But if you've got any questions and you want to come and chat with me, I'll be here at the end and you can ask away. Thank you very much.